Emerging from the ashes of the Second World War, two new powerful giants stood facing each other, the Soviet Union and the United States. Both nations had been catapulted into a war not of their own choosing, but both emerged economically and politically intact. How did the Cold War start? How did it develop? Were the elements of the Cold War conflict already built into the international arena? Some theorists believe that the Cold War had its roots in the disturbed international equilibrium, while others contend its underlying causes were mainly ideological. The purpose of this film strip is to examine the origins of the Cold War. For many years following independence, the United States opposed what George Washington had called foreign entanglements. In large part, this was because the United States was too involved with internal expansion to be active in foreign affairs. This changed temporarily during the First World War, when the United States reverted to isolationism. That is, until December 7th, 1941. On that momentous day, Japan attacked the American military and naval bases at Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands. Within a few hours, the United States declared war on Japan, marking the entry into World War II and a new era in American history. The country's participation in World War II produced a decisive Allied military victory, and as a result, the responsibilities of world leadership was thrust on the United States. With the end of World War II, a new kind of struggle emerged, the Cold War. What are the precepts underlying the international relations relevant to foreign relations and the Cold War? Primarily, every nation has self-interests, such as freedom from foreign invasion and desire for economic prosperity. Consequently, government's foreign policy is frequently used to further these national interests. Not surprisingly, the interests of one nation often conflict with those of another, and sometimes the problems that arise from conflicting interests defy diplomacy and lead to war. Defeating the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan was the primary foreign policy of the Allied nations throughout World War II. But with victory, the political aims of the former Allies, the United States and the Soviet Union, increasingly came into serious conflict. Historic circumstances have much to do with these post-World War events. The United States, for example, had abundant land and natural resources within her own borders. What is more, the United States is separated from most of the world by two large oceans. Consequently, foreign adventure was never considered necessary for either the internal security or the economic prosperity of the United States. This explains why many American leaders condemned the old balance of power system. In their view, it must inevitably lead to war. After World War II, the United States hoped to completely restructure international politics through an international body like the United Nations. For it was believed that only through collective security could peace be preserved for all. Americans hoped the UN would safeguard the rights of all nations to determine their own form of government through democratic processes. The United States had been successful in achieving self-determination, and her citizens believed that other people should have the same opportunity for free choice. The Russians, on the other hand, felt an historic need to increase the security on the western border. Poland had served as the invasion corridor in the First World War and earlier in the Napoleonic Wars. Therefore, Russia's post-war demands were evident even as early as 1941, when Hitler's army invaded the country through Poland. To gain this security, Russia determined to extend her western frontier by annexing part of Finland, the Baltic nations, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the eastern part of Poland, and in the unannexed area to set up a friendly post-war Polish government. Russia also wanted the area of Romania that she had absorbed before Hitler's attack. This would enable her to dominate the whole Balkan Peninsula. In addition, the Soviet Union had plans to secure warm water seaports. This too reflected an historic need, since most of the major Russian rivers flow toward the northern coast, which is usually icebound. Failure to recognize this potentially dangerous situation rests largely with the Western leaders, particularly the Americans, who insisted that political problems be deferred until after the major military ones were successfully eliminated. The inability to resolve political differences became apparent only after the war was over. Perhaps this failure to anticipate post-war conflicts was part of a greater failure to understand the nature of the war itself. It has been theorized that no alliance of the world's democratic nations could hope for military victory against the combined armed strength of Hitler's Germany, Mussolini's Italy, Stalin's Russia, and Tojo's Japan without the collaboration with one of the totalitarian powers. The Second World War was not a struggle to further democratic purposes, but a war in which democratic nations fought for survival. This has been made clear by George F. Kennan, expert on foreign affairs and former American ambassador to the Soviet Union. Kennan points out that if collaboration with one of the major dictatorships continued until total victory was achieved, major concessions to the victorious partner should have been expected. And if these concessions were ones that the democratic nations were unwilling to make, the result would be tension and confrontation. When the United States entered World War II, the immediate major interests were in the Pacific. At Churchill's urging, however, Roosevelt agreed to help defeat Germany first. Once this was accomplished, the Western leaders had Stalin's promise to fight Japan. They also had his price for doing so: large territorial concessions in Asia. It has been argued that if the United States and Britain had agreed to stop Japan first, the Soviet Union would have faced German forces almost alone, which would have considerably weakened that country for the balance of the war. Occupied in her fierce struggle with Germany, the Soviet Union would have been unable to fight Japan at the same time, and would have had little influence in the settlement of Asian affairs. From the time Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941 until November 1942, Russian troops bore the brunt of the German land forces. It was believed that despite aid, Russia would become progressively weaker in her struggle with Germany. But the Russians were able, with considerable U.S. material aid, to continue the fight on the Eastern Front. And after the victory of Stalingrad in 1943, they steadily moved from a defensive position to an offensive position. All along, the Soviet Union had demanded the opening of a second front elsewhere in Europe. Finally, in 1944, the United States and Great Britain launched the offensive in France. Europe was liberated by American and British troops advancing east to meet Soviet troops marching west. As the Russians moved west, they occupied large portions of Eastern Europe, territory that they clearly wanted to control in the future. An alternate policy which might have weakened the Soviet bargaining position at the end of the war, it can be argued, would have been an invasion of Europe through the Balkan countries. American and British soldiers therefore could have occupied much of the territory in Eastern Europe, which eventually fell to the Soviets. Whether alternative military strategies would have proven successful or even feasible is impossible to know. What is obvious, however, is that American and British conduct of the war involved Soviet collaboration until the end and led to a Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and Asia. When the Yalta Conference convened early in February 1945, the Soviet Union had the military and political leverage to protect these gains. Of all the Allied meetings held during the war, Yalta was the most important and controversial. From February 4th until February 11th, 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met at Yalta in the Russian Crimea to set military policy for the concluding stages of the war and make political settlements for the post-war period. The major political agreements concerned the formation of governments for the Eastern European countries and Poland, the future of Germany, the Far East, and the United Nations. In the Far East, Stalin agreed to 1. Enter the war against Japan 3 months after Germany's defeat. 2. Recognize China's sovereignty over Manchuria. And 3. Conclude a treaty of alliance with Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government. In return, Stalin obtained 1. The Kuril Islands, South Sakhalin. 2. Recognition of Russia's control of Outer Mongolia. 3. Recovery of territory and rights lost at the end of the Russo-Japanese War. The rights, all in Manchuria, included preeminent interest in the internationalized port of Dairen, lease of Port Arthur as a naval base, and joint Soviet-Chinese control of the Chinese Eastern and South Manchurian railroads. In Poland, Stalin insisted on a new eastern frontier that would give the Soviet Union considerable Polish territory. Although Roosevelt and Churchill reluctantly agreed to this demand, they never consented to give parts of eastern Germany to Poland in compensation for the territory lost to Russia. They did agree, however, on the composition of a new government for Poland. This agreement called for reorganization of the provisional government established by the Polish communists to include members of the Polish government in exile, which was supported by the Americans and British. With free elections later to select a new government, the other small Eastern European countries were guaranteed the opportunity to establish democratic governments by democratic means as well. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin also made several decisions concerning Germany. They agreed in principle to divide the country into separate states, but in fact, German territory was reduced by ceding portions to Russia and Poland. At the insistence of Roosevelt and Churchill, Stalin reluctantly consented to give France an occupying sector if it was carved out of the American and British areas. As a result, Germany was divided into 4 zones instead of 3 as previously planned, and France joined the Allied Control Council. It was also tentatively agreed that reparations were to be exacted from Germany in 3 ways. 1 was the removal within 2 years of all materials necessary for war production. Another was the delivery of manufactured goods for a period to be determined later. And the third was the use of forced German labor. Specified problems of reparations were to be referred to a separate commission. Stalin felt payments should amount to $20 billion in equipment and goods, half for the Soviet Union. Roosevelt agreed, but only as the basis for discussion by the Reparations Commission. The Potsdam Conference, held near Berlin in late July 1945 and attended by President Harry Truman, Premier Joseph Stalin, and Clement Attlee, the newly elected English Prime Minister. Here the agreement made at Yalta was confirmed to divide Germany into 4 occupation zones with the United States, Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France as the occupation forces. Their purpose? To disarm, denazify, and democratize Germany. Stalin's other major concessions concerned the United Nations Charter. Stalin agreed to the American proposals that in the Security Council the veto power not apply to procedural matters, and that a nation abstain from voting in the Security Council on disputes in which it was directly involved. Stalin also consented to invite certain Latin American nations to join the United Nations as charter members, thus giving the United States added strength in the General Assembly. Finally, Stalin withdrew his previous demand that all 16 republics of the Soviet Union be given individual membership. Instead, a compromise was worked out by which Russia and the United States were each allowed 3 votes in the General Assembly, an option, incidentally, which the United States didn't exercise until 1970. Roosevelt returned from Yalta full of optimism, believing that the bases had been laid for a better world. Since only part of the Yalta agreements were immediately made public, most Americans shared his enthusiasm. Many Americans, however, became disillusioned when they learned of the secret accords, and it became apparent that Stalin intended to despoil parts of Germany and set up satellite governments in Eastern Europe. Critics later charged that Roosevelt unilaterally signed away China's sovereignty in Manchuria, the most industrialized part of China, in exchange for for Russian military help that was not needed to defeat Japan. On the other hand, defenders of the president claimed that Japan was by no means defeated in February 1945. Since the atom bomb had not yet been perfected, bloody conquest of the Japanese home island seemed necessary. Facing such prospects, it was argued that Russia was needed to engage Japanese troops in China. Defenders of Roosevelt pointed out that the United States could not have prevented Russia from declaring war on Japan and marching into Manchuria once she decided she could benefit from such action. Critics of Roosevelt were particularly incensed over Russian treatment of Poland and Eastern Europe. All the Allies had agreed to the principles of national self-determination, but this principle was violated by turning over sections of Poland to Russia and sections of Germany to Poland. Critics charged that arrangements for the Polish provisional government virtually assured its becoming a communist puppet regime. Similarly, other Eastern European governments were lost to Moscow's control. The hopes of countless people for personal and national freedom were destroyed. In June 1944, shortly after British and American troops began the invasion of France at Normandy Beach, Russian troops swept through the Baltic states, Poland, and the Eastern European countries. By the time of the Yalta Conference, 8 months later, Soviet units not only had secured Eastern Europe, but also were closing in on Berlin. Defenders of President Roosevelt maintained that these military realities determined his course. The apologists point out that the Allies continued to need Soviet aid in crushing Germany, and furthermore, Roosevelt had little bargaining power, since the American public would not have supported a new war to rid Eastern and Central Europe of communist control. The failure to decide on the fate of Germany has also been severely criticized. In place of the tentative plan to divide Germany into separate states, Eastern territory was ceded to Poland, causing the dislocation of millions of people. Americans were also shocked at Roosevelt's acquiescence to Stalin's plans for exacting forced labor and huge reparations from Germany. In defense of Roosevelt, though, many point out that Soviet control of Central Europe was fait accompli. And of course, Stalin would insist on protecting his borders no matter what the cost in German and Polish land. There was also anger over the agreement to admit 2 Soviet republics to the United Nations as separate voting members. Because all of the Soviet republics were under the control of the central government in Moscow, granting any one of them a separate vote denied the concept of the United Nations as an association of independent states. In defense of Roosevelt, it can be stated that because the United Nations was his hope for future world peace and stability, and because he knew it could succeed only if all major powers were members, Roosevelt had to make concessions to ensure Soviet participation. So, although the dispute over Yalta continues, any argument about the agreements at the end of World War II must take into consideration at least 2 factors. 1, the United States had certain definite goals for the post-war world, which required the cooperation of the Soviet Union. 2, Russian armies were already in control of much of the territory in Eastern Europe discussed by the leaders at Yalta. George F. Kennan believed that the importance of Yalta and the other wartime conferences have been overrated because Roosevelt gave away little that Stalin did not already have or could not have taken. Unfortunately, what the conference did was raise false hopes about the future of Europe and Asia, hopes which the Allied victory could not realize. But most Americans, including Roosevelt, saw World War II as a moral quest which could result in the basic alteration of international affairs. The United States believed it could replace the balance of power system based on alliances and armaments with a system of collective security based on international trust. It is against this background that Americans moved into the Cold War. They could not foresee the long, hard struggle that would tax the nation's patience and ingenuity. The old theory that wars not only solve problems but create additional ones seems valid when applied to the post-World War II era.